WhiskyJason here, whiskey from the viewpoint of an American over here in Germany tasting rare and exotic whiskey, and today I have the third of the four hand-filled exclusive Warehouse 9 editions, and this time it is a wine hogshead. Yay! Now, all I know is that it is 11 years old. So if I do the math backwards, that would mean it's 2009. So this bottle was actually filled on the 16th of September 2020. So not by me, but 2 years ago, 1.5 years ago by someone else at the distillery. And this is 57% ABV. What am I going to compare it to? At the moment, I'm always comparing it to the bourbon cask matured from 2007, which is a 12-year-old with 55.7%. I was at the distillery at the beginning of May, and that was the first distillery we actually visited out on Isla, and I thoroughly enjoyed myself and found the distillery to be fascinating. So what I'm going to do in this video, warning, I'm not going to have the focus on the tasting, I'm going to focus on history lesson time. All right, so if you want to learn more about this, Whiskybase number 192206. I'll come back to that in a second. Now, it's very interesting that the Bunnahabhain distillery was built 1881. So there is no tradition of a secret distilling, illicit distills, nothing being hidden from the taxmen, the excise men, nothing like this. This was actually in the boom days that was booming the economy, and Victorian age, industrialization was happening, whiskey distillation was a well-established business, and they are just people that got together and said, hey, let's build a distillery. Now, very interesting, some people say that the Bunnahabhain distillery was the architect. We have no paperwork on who was the architect. Nothing has been found, at least that I know of yet. Many people said it was built by an architect that had built numerous prisons in Scotland. And it looks a little bit like a fortress, a prison. Well, actually, it was designed to mimic a Bordeaux chateau. Just like Bruichladdich, it was actually a purpose-built distillery. Most distilleries up to that point had been farmhouses that had been converted and this and that. Bruichladdich built 1881, the same year with Bunnahabhain, 1881. Wow. So the first distillation was 1882, but all right, and so they were built, and it was actually a gravity distillery, just like McMurra in Sweden says, we're the gravity distillery. There was a steam-driven elevator that took the grains up to the top, and that was where the malting floors were, and then a little bit lower down you had the mash tun, and a little bit lower down you had then the washbacks, and a little bit lower down you had the stills, and a little bit lower down you actually had then the filling area. And then even further down you had the warehouses. And so the distillery was built on purpose. They were actually built this here on that site to produce 900,000 liters of spirit a year. That's a lot. That was one of the biggest distilleries back then in 1880s. Now, my question that I really can't understand is why Isla? Yeah, now I know Speyside built their distilleries there because there was fresh water. Okay, Bunna has fresh water. They have a spring and they have a river. So the next thing you need to have, water is very important. No water, no distillery. The next thing you need to have is barley. Now, barley doesn't really grow very well on Isla. So they had to ship everything in. Now, there was a nice little bay, or there is a nice little bay, Bunna, there's a pier they built and all that. So, transportation, back in Speyside, they had the trains. Here we have then the boats. And the third thing you need is, after you have your water, and you have your transportation, and you have your barley, so I guess the fourth thing you need is, in this case, peat. Now, on the Speyside, you didn't need the peat. You did need a source of heat, but you did need the peat. So here we have the peat. So I think Bruichladdich and Bunna, as an assumption, I might be totally wrong, were built there just because of the source of peat. And the barley was taken in, and the whiskey was then shipped out. All right, so the Isla Distillery Company. Now, it's important who founded this. It was organized 1879. They actually bought some property there in 1880. The sound of Isla is perfect for that. If you have the map of Isla, let's just say it looks a little bit like this. Over here, you have the Atlantic Ocean, harsh climate, and you're the northeast, so you're somewhat protected from all those gale winds and the waves and so on. And all the warehouses are actually close to the water there. So we have a founders of the company. We have James Ford of William Ford and Sons, which was a tea, wine, and spirits merchant from Edinburgh. And then you had James Watson Greenless. He was a partner here and then we have McMurtry and Ralston of Campbellton. And then the next important person was Robertson, William W.A. Robertson of Robertson and Baxter. That was a wholesale whiskey merchant. So he had something called Cutty Sark. He had something called Scottish Leader. And later on, he had a blend called Black Bottle. So now this distillery was producing heavily peated whiskeys. So we're talking about not what they're doing today. We're talking about 40%, 40 ppm here. And that is a lot. So the distillery was built at the mouth of the Margadale River, which where it enters the Bunnahabhain Bay. So most of the distilleries are named after the area there. And interesting enough that even today they pay for the use of the water from the springs in whiskey. Good. So I had the Loch Stoinsha, and at local springs, at a natural harbor, everything was there that they basically needed. Now, let's move on here to a man named Alfred Barnard. 1885, he visited the distillery. He was writing a book about the distilleries of the whiskey industry and so on, and he was very much impressed by how modern this distillery was. So, now, interesting enough, the company made a profit in the first year. Why? Because they didn't need to wait back then 3 years. 1996 was the year in which the law of Scotland, England, Scotland, Great Britain declared 3 years minimum. Before that, you could sell it actually younger. Now, the thing is, they were not bottling Bunnahabhain whiskey. There was no Bunnahabhain label. There was no Bunnahabhain bottlings out there. Everything from Bunnahabhain was made for the blending industry. It's a workhorse. All right. So, and that's what they had there. Very, very quickly, the Isla Distilling Company was then joined together by William Grant. We know them. The owners of Glenrothes Distillery. And they renamed the company Highland Distillers. Highland would actually go on and acquire Glenglassaugh Distillery, 1892, Tamdhu, 1898, and even Highland Park, 1937. Well, even today they have Macallan. I don't know when that came in the fold, but that's okay. At the 1920s, they were at their peak. They were producing enough malt to supply over 180 different blenders, which I think is interesting. So, Bunna, from its conception all the way up until 1960, basically 63, was a heavily, heavily peated whiskey. All right, very oily whiskey. A very heavily peated. So, even the water they take from Loch Stanisha flows over peat and has a little bit of a light brown color. Now, today, they get the water up from the Markadale Springs, and it's crystal clear. All right, so now what happened is that in 1993, because they had these blends, you had your black bottles, you had your Scottish Leader, you had your Cutty Sark. that they had too many whiskey producing distilleries that were peated, but not enough in the group that were producing unpeated. So what they did is they basically said, switch. So they switched in favor of unpeated whiskeys. They had Famous Grouse also in their product line, and that was very, very important. So what they did is in 1963 is they went from 2 stills to 4 stills. And the new stills were actually bigger, 35,400 liters. The spirit stills were 15,500 liters. I thought some of the biggest pot stills were in Glenfarclas with 30,000. They're bigger here at Bunna, very, very big. The floor maltings were eliminated. 6 new large washbacks were introduced with a capacity of 100,000 liters. That's a lot. All right, so, and the capacity went from 0.9 to 2.5 million liters. All right, so that is very, very important. 1900, Bunna received a cast iron behemoth of a mash tun, which had a 7-ton capacity. Now, it was replaced by a 15-ton mash tun in 1999. It was once again replaced by a stainless steel. And the original mash tun ended up at Bruichladdich, where it's still used today. Very, very interesting. So in the 1970s, the distillery started to bottle small quantities of a 12-year-old single malt. And that was very, very interesting. By the late 1980s, the distillery had a core line built around the 12-year-old, which was fantastic. Now, 1991, the first experimental run with peated whiskey after 1963, so over 30 years later, basically, it was like, okay, can we do this? 28 ppm instead of the old 45. Now, today they get their peated malt from Port Ellen Maltings. The second batch, 1997, so 6 years later, 38 ppm. And they started selling this to the independent bottlers. Now, a lot of things happened. Highland Distillers turned into Addington. And Addington sold in 2003, we'll never understand why, the distillery to Burn Stewart, including the Black Bottle and the Scottish Leader brands. So basically, they bought the brands and got a distillery on top of it. Now, Burn Stewart was a Trinidad-based spirits company, and Addington retained most of the maturing stock. They continued to even rely on Bunnahabhain. They had a 5-year contract to supply whiskey for their Famous Grouse and the Cutty Shark blends. Now, Burn Stewart actually owned the Tobermory and the Deanston distillery, and they got into some financial difficulties. They were bankrupt. And so what happened was that actually then the distributor for Burn Stewart's down there in South Africa, Distill, bought the 3 distilleries as well as the stock and profited then from that company declaring insolvency. So, Burn Stewart actually cranked up Bunnahabhain's production, began to emphasize the brand as a single malt, began to produce peated whiskeys for inclusion in the distillery's core range. And back then it was about 20%. Today it's about 35% is peated. And so we have a very, very interesting thing. Distill has now invested 18 million into the distillery, tore down warehouses, built a new visitor center with a gift shop, have improved access to the roads, and they will actually be building new warehouses and investing a lot into that company. Finally, this is the distillery worth investing in my opinion. All right, so you came here for a whiskey review. You're getting a history lesson in Bunna. I knew one of my videos of these would just be about that. I love the smell of this wine cask. I have like a berry, cranberry, raspberry, strawberry vanilla moment here going on. Very, very nice. The 57% not even really recognizable. The bourbon, 55.7. A lot more of a vanilla spice, a little bit of a honey moment. You really can recognize, at least I believe that I can recognize the difference the cask influences have here. All right, so let's try these. Now, the 57% is a little bit hot for me. I'm going to dilute it down to about 50%. Some people are going to say it's perfect. Other people are going to say, like me, it's a little hot. It is oily. It is nice. And the wine moment just shines through. There's a sweetness in here as well. A berry sweetness. I called it the berry vanilla moment. Over here, with a little bit more water added. I hope this is somewhere between 50 and 52%. And that beautiful, beautiful distillate of Bunna together with this red wine cask finish is just very nice. C+, B- moment with water. Do I prefer this over that? Actually, I do. This is good. This is a tad bit better. This is a little bit pure, unadulterated. Even here, diluting it down to 52%, around about 50-52, actually makes this whiskey better, in my personal opinion. Other people are like, God made it like this. Don't mess with it. Which is okay. So one thing that I would also like to mention real quick is just the production. So what we have here, let's say we're producing 2 million liters a year. So let's go for 40 weeks of production, 7 days a week. You're going to be producing about 25 barrels of distillate of new make every single day. That goes into about 250 liter casks. I just took the average of our bourbon barrels, hogsheads, and the butts. So one butt would be 2 hogsheads, would be almost 3 then from our bourbon barrels. But just say we have a total of 25 barrels. So what you do basically there is you're going to be producing for your contracts. Unfortunately, we want money now. So we'd be filling whiskey probably in casks other people have sent to us. Let it be sherry, let it be predominantly probably bourbon. So the next thing you do is you go, okay, we have a core range product. We have our Bunna 12. So we're going to actually be filling 3/4 bourbon, 1/4 then sherry. So 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, it would just be bourbon. Bourbon, 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 bourbon. Then a week of sherry, maybe 2 weeks, and then bourbon, bourbon, bourbon. And then we might have 1 day or 2 days a month where we go, oh, let's do something special. Let's get some casks. Let's get some wine hogsheads. Let's get some French rejuvenated oak. Let's get some port pipes. And let's fill this day's production into those casks. Now, if we're going to do a release one day, let's say we're looking 12 years, 15 years in the future, and we want to do a special release of a Bunnahabhain, and we want to have 5,000 bottles. So 5,000 bottles at cask strength, we need about 22, 23 hogsheads. Ta-da! The 1 day's production. So on 1 day, they can actually produce enough whiskey for about 5,000 bottles. Now, if you want to have a bigger release with 40 to 50,000 bottles, so you have it all over the world without any big problem. So you're going to be looking at a whole week's production, and you need to have those casks. Cask procurement is a very, very sophisticated and complicated thing. You need to get them to the island. They need to be checked for the quality. They cannot spoil. You should not be delivering then port casks, sherry casks, and so on in the summertime when it's hot. It might not be hot in Scotland, but it was hot in Spain where they sent them from, or from Portugal. So we want to make sure that our seasons are set up all right. And we're doing that. And then, of course, we have peated and unpeated. So 1/3 peated, 2/3 unpeated. Maybe we want to put that peated product into also a port pipe, also into a hogshead and so on, and see what happens there. And that's the very interesting thing about whiskey is you do it, and then you might find out in 10 to 12 years how it turned out. And this is a long-term game here. So but the majority of what you're going to do is just standard. Your bourbon barrels, your sherry, that's what we want, that's what we need, that's what we will use in all of our core range products. But a few of these barrels might actually just be a honey barrel, where you just try them and go, oh, that's even too good to mix under a big batch. I'm going to have a distillery exclusive. I'm going to fill it up just for the people at the gift shop. And ta-da, that's what we get. So we get some of the best bottles out there, some of the best barrels out there, and we can hand fill them, or at least buy the hand fill. During COVID, it wasn't allowed to fill them up ourselves, but maybe one day soon that will be possible. All right, so my question of the day is, what is your favorite wine cask whiskey? It can be a Bunna, it can be something else. So a wine cask, that's all I have here. I have a wine hogshead. A red wine, in my opinion. So which one did you prefer and like the best? Thank you very much for watching. Thank you very much for subscribing. Thank you very much for paying attention to my history lesson of Bunna. Hopefully I got most of the facts right. If not, write it down in a comment. I'm still learning and I'm teaching, and I'm actually passing on the information that I have understood so far. So part of my development here to a whiskey teacher. And I ask you to maybe recommend this channel to someone who has not yet discovered it. That'd be great. All the best, WhiskyJason here. Bye-bye.